When you realize how much supply chain order activity is generated from spreadsheets on a daily basis around the world, and then you realize that in almost 90% of spreadsheets, there is an error in at least 1% of the cells, you start thinking about that. And on a global basis, you start thinking, oh boy, there's a lot of bad ordering happening. So it's crazy.
Thanks so much for joining another edition of the Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement for companies running SAP. Today, we are joined by Chad Smith. Chad is the co-founder, partner, and founder of the Demand Driven Institute. Chad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Sean.
Awesome. So it's not every day I have the immense pleasure of geeking out on supply chain, some of the fallacies and calculations and giant potholes that we dig for ourselves on our highways of supply chain. Can you help us out with where did this term demand-driven come from? And what does that mean for an organization when somebody says that?
Well, it's been around a lot longer than most people think. The origin is 2002 from a company called PeopleSoft, which at the time was the second largest ERP company on the planet. And my business partner, Carol Bertak, was the vice president of manufacturing and distribution industries there. And they came up with this term, a demand-driven, and the way they defined it was sensing and adapting to demand all in real time and pulling through from suppliers. So they had this really cool vision of flow, response to real demand. The only problem is they didn't know how to do it. So that's where I came in. I'd known Carol since about the late 90s. And she gave me a call. My company was working with larger manufacturers at the time, putting in systems like that. And we were beating our heads against the wall of these green screen legacy systems that we just couldn't get them to do what we wanted to do. So we started coding software to it. And I said before, if you ever feel like you know a topic really well, try to code software to it, and it will tell you just what you don't know.
It's like if you want to learn something, if you can't teach it to somebody else, then.
Yes, absolutely. So we began working with them on this idea of demand driven, but then something happened that was pretty disruptive. Oracle completed a hostile takeover of PeopleSoft. And so the term demand driven just kind of withered and died. And then it was all of a sudden kind of co-opted by an analyst firm to really kind of mean better forecasting. And Carol and I got together about 2008-ish, and I was showing her what we'd been working on. She was teaching, and she got super excited. And when I saw her level of excitement, I got really excited too. And so we started writing. And one of the things that we began to write about was, what does demand-driven really mean? What are the principles of it? And what problem are we solving, kind of thing, right? Because I was told, I learned very early on, you can't sell a solution unless you can sell the problem. So we began to write about what the problem really was. And that led to McGraw-Hill coming to us and saying, hey, we have a book that needs revision. Would you please revise Orlicky's material requirements planning? And Carol and I just kind of looked at each other and said, well, this is perfect. Now we have the opportunity to not only explain what the current system is, what the current planning parameters are, but now we have the opportunity to introduce it, what they should be to the world. And so that book was released in 2011. We founded the Demand Driven Institute in 2011. And from there, what we've done is we've kind of built out a complete demand-driven approach for organizations.
I think that sense of planning ahead, and it's not a new topic, this idea of material requirements planning, MRP, and having the system do a bunch of the math for how much product the organization is going to need. I mean, even as recently as a year or two ago, I was hearing about an organization, brilliant engineers. They're in aerospace, and they could not believe that a computer could calculate the requirements for what they were going to build.
Right.
And it boggles my mind that some of the brightest minds in, developing spaceflight are
Right.
still having trouble with the idea that a computer can do math.
Right.
So this idea that MRP has some sense of fallacy. What I found remarkable is this underlying, well, but it keeps thinking that.
Mhm.
But we know it's not true.
Right.
So what is it that MRP assumes is true as an inviolatable rule, but we
Right.
all know it's not true? And how does that get in the way of belief and adoption in the process?
Well, we have to wind the clock back to the late 50s to really understand the origins of MRP. At the time, it was called DBOM. It's good for like bill of material processor. And Orlicky, uh, along with a few other people, uh, realized that if he could add product structure and time phasing, all of a sudden, and then by the way, we've got the computers coming up, right? We've got these mainframes. IBM threw a bunch of money into this because they wanted to sell mainframes. And so by 1965, we actually had the term material requirements plan. And we actually had the codification of all the planning rules that we still use today. Those rules haven't changed. And we're talking 60 years that we're still using the same planning approaches. Now, Orlicky's big assumption, he knew there were problems. In fact, in his first book in 1975, he identified a few of the problems, but his assumption was the power of computing would overcome them. He could have never envisioned a world that we have today. Completely different world. So one of the things that MRP assumes or has to obey, because it's just a giant calculator, is it has to obey product structure and the fixed lead times in the product structure. So that's called a cumulative lead time. So it has to calculate all the requirements through the full cumulative lead time. There's some exceptions, but that's basically 98% of the time it's going to do that. The problem is that because we are now sourcing globally, because we are now selling globally, what's happened to our cumulative lead times? They've elongated, right? Certainly from 1965, they've elongated. And we did it to ourselves, by the way. We did it in the name of cost reduction. And then now we've got Amazon. So now we're selling everywhere. So we also have drones. So we have this customer tolerance time that's crazy. The customer wants it now, but it takes us longer to get it through our supply chain. So therein lies a huge problem. And it began to break down in the 80s, and it's just been gasoline on the fire since 2000s. So one of the inviolate rules that we had to revisit is, why do we have to calculate using full cumulative lead time? Why can't we decouple at certain points and still use basic MRP principles between those points? Something we call a decoupled explosion. But why can't we do that? And ironically, what happens is at certain points, we slow flow down so that flow overall can be protected and promoted to ultimately the source of cash. Somebody's paying us money for it. So that's one of the biggest changes that we had to propose. And it's amazing. People just really want to hang on to calculating full cumulative lead time. I don't know why.
It's a comfortable place. It's an assumption that we've become accustomed to, right?
It's not, because what happens is it's not very comfortable for any planner or buyer, because on a daily basis, they're running around with their hairs on fire, opening up multiple spreadsheets and trying to figure out exactly what is real and what is not real. Because they know if I just approve everything today, half of what I do today is going to change tomorrow. So, and it's just like lather, rinse, repeat. Every day I go through this cycle where I'm just juggling what the real priorities are. And half the time I don't really even know.
And as they change, the more we move it, it starts to feel to some planners like they're pushing rope uphill. And this can create a sense of exasperation of, this machine isn't even really working. This is all just voodoo. And I think that idea, I think you've got an analogy that really resonates for a lot of folks where, what drives a bunch of this, and where does this ultimately take people, or where does this take some of the planning teams? What does that feel like for some organizations?
Well, first of all, for the organizations, every organization is different, but I know the people. I've talked and worked with thousands of planners and buyers. Um, Life's not fun. And the other thing, and I've got a thought that I'll expound on that a little bit later, but um, the idea that they're forced to use tools that they know do not work. And because they know that if they approved everything the way that MRP tells them to approve, they will not have a job. It's that simple. In fact, I've seen planners and buyers print out screenshots of the system and put it in their file cabinet to say, this is what, so they have evidence of this is what the system told me. I know I might get in trouble on this. And that's the I think organizations are failing their people because they're forcing their people to use tools that we all know have inappropriate rules. And so that's when the chaos really begins, because that's when the spreadsheet proliferation comes in.
Yep.
And
And people are
everybody's got,
second guessing and double checking and creating a contingency plan for when they're convinced something isn't actually going to show up on time.
right. And I've never been in an organization that has a vice president of spreadsheets, because there's no enforcement. There's no consistency. We
Some
don't know.
companies call that the CFO.
Yeah, but we don't know if these spreadsheets, Bill's spreadsheet versus Marcia's spreadsheet, it's totally different. And
Yep.
we have no idea. We're just assuming that Bill and Marcia actually know how to do a spreadsheet and
It's
maintain
like
it.
JP Morgan's multi-billion-dollar spreadsheet
Bingo.
error that you go, whoops.
Bingo. When you realize how much supply chain order activity is generated from spreadsheets on a daily basis around the world, and then you realize that in almost 90% of spreadsheets, there is an error in at least 1% of the cells, you start thinking about that. And on a global basis, you start thinking, oh boy, there's a lot of bad ordering happening. So it's crazy.
It's an
Now,
exponential that I don't care to try to calculate in terms of the total cost.
correct. Now, I told you I wanted to expound on a point. Once again, I said that I think organizations are kind of failing their people, and it's taken a real impact on people. And so organizations, and I have a lot of C-level people that say, I can't find good people. I can't find good young people to get into supply chain. Well,
Yep.
no duh. They
Yeah.
do things.
They sit them down in front of their dad's ERP,
Right.
and then they say, by the way, we know the math is wrong, but we need you to follow it.
Right. I don't want to pick on any particular system. But if you look at the MRP or materials management module in big systems, it looks brutal, right? and you put it in front of a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old, and they go, an iPad generation, they go, what in the world are we doing here? It's
Yep.
not intuitive for them. It's not fun. The technology does not work in a way that they're used to interacting with technology. And
Yeah.
so when you do get a young planner, promising young planner, you know what they do? They jump to another part of the organization as soon as they have an opportunity.
Because they wake up every day and they have this sense of, man, I would rather
What
poke
am I
my eye out
doing?
with my mouse.
Exactly. What am I doing here? Exactly.
And then I think this also gets to the heart of how some critical assumptions in the standard approach to MRP planning, supply chain planning, creates this overemphasis on time in full.
Mhm.
And then it is amplified by over-index in just in time and a elongation and increase in risk. And we are definitely in a stage right now where there is increased global supply chain risk for a variety of reasons. And when we consider what that starts to do, we then have a whole set of contractual provisions and a whole set of reports and a whole set of meetings around something that has been already over-indexed based on a false premise and a calculation engine that then starts to drive some really curious behaviors down the line.
I have a trick question that I ask every buyer. Okay. I say, would you rather have your supplier be on time and full 100% of the time, or would you rather have your supplier never stock you out? They are not the same thing.
No.
Okay. And by the way, about 90% of the planners on time and full, 100%. Really? Because does on time and full always tell the whole story? It just means they complied with a planning signal that was probably tied to a forecast that definitely had error associated with it.
And
But
had a lead time that may not
right,
have been recalculated in 7 years.
right. And so then the follow-up question is, do you ever have on time and full, but are still stocked out on things? And they say, yeah, I guess I do.
Uh-oh.
So, yeah. I mean, the minute you start to think about it, like what really matters here, and this is the whole thing the whole foundation of demand driven, what really matters here is the flow, right?
Yeah.
Whether you want to focus on things like cost or on time in full, whatever, all of that stuff moves in the right direction when flow is occurring. All right. When you have good flow, cost performance is better. Why?
Yeah.
We don't have expedites. We don't have additional freight,
And you actually have product to sell.
correct. You generate cash. So,
One of my favorite examples of that is the thing that we assume to always be true is, well, you better not increase your prices, Mr. Supplier. And it was just recently, one of the large chemical suppliers, instead of holding to that rule that they had a few brilliant minds that recognized that was no longer going to serve them. It was something people take for granted that they recognized cognitively. Hats off to them, because they turned around to their suppliers and they said, I don't care how much you charge me, ship me double.
Yeah.
And their market share doubled because they were the ones that actually had product to sell. So when you talk about flow, sometimes our own behaviors and calculations and assumptions that maybe were true at a point in time, but are no longer, get in the way of our business and can actually shrink it by half in some cases for the competitors of that organization.
I have a similar story. I was working with a very large paper company, and they had a sales policy that if you bought large volumes, you would get a discount let's say per unit. And I said, okay, well, do we understand what this is doing to us? Basically, we're just getting erratic order patterns that just come in big slugs. I said, why not offer them incentives to order more frequently? And it's just like, wait a minute, hold on, just blew their mind. Because the point is, you want real, valid
Whoa.
demand signals that are pacing with their needs. That then allows you to align your assets to actual need. Aligning a company's assets, that means your fixed structure, that means your brick and mortar, that means your working capital. Aligning your assets to what is actually required by the market is the only path to good return on investment.
I love it. There's a sense of flow, a sense of continuity, and a sense of stability that can come with that. But it's a constant check of the assumptions and are the beliefs that this is something that one of our customers has struggled with. They're very successful. They got to a certain stage, but they have held on to a bunch of the beliefs, and they are so satisfied with their progress of getting to where they are now that they are now being held back, and they've stalled out because they won't let go of some of the things that served them earlier on. And I think that's something that we're all at risk of. And so the constant learning mindset, the constant sense of humility of what got us here won't get us there, is one of those things that I think comes out of understanding the assumptions in our planning systems and our supply chains is underrated.
Right. We said this in one of our books. It was that let's talk about things called rules, right? All rules are life limited, right? Every rule is life limited, and every rule has to be appropriate, right? We always say we use the term rules before tools, right? Because you're always questioning the rules. But there should be overlying principles that your rules should always relate to. And one of those overlying principles, it's always been the case in supply chain, is flow.
Yeah. It's such an undervalued attribute of the most efficient supply chains that I think either of us have seen. Chad, when somebody is looking for help to go take their supply chain to the next level, how do they reach out to you and your team to get help from you?
Well, we work with an affiliate network around the world. We have hundreds of instructors. We have service providers. We also have dozens and dozens of compliant pieces of software. So this is very large software companies that have coded to our specifications. You can go to demanddriveninstitute.com. You can click on compliant software and you can see, I think your average viewer might be very surprised, the very large software companies that have said, okay, we're going all in on this. And you'd be surprised at some of the very large consulting firms, global consulting firms that are also, that we also work with. I would just say, you don't have to comply with the common nonsense. All right. You can start a demand-driven journey very easily. Also, if you want to have your mind blown, go to our case study section. We have just dropped a bunch of videos, a bunch of case studies. In one case, this is a $4 billion company. They spent $34,000 on an improvement project. And in 2 years, it returned $120 million in cash to them. And they
A
are not
beautiful
done
ROI.
yet. Across 53 plants. Yeah. I mean, it's almost, you can't even, it's like infinite.
Yeah. We ran out of numbers on the width
Right.
of this page.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And there's a better way. And you don't have to listen to me. You can go listen to the people that are doing it.
I love it. I love the show them, don't tell them, Chad.
Yeah.
Something that's always been near and dear to me. Chad, I really appreciate you joining us today, sharing your experience, wisdom, and helping folks get inspired for what good looks like for a stronger supply chain and procurement. Chad, thank you again. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Sean. Take care.